This is another iRaw podcast.
Hello, I'm Amelia Lease, and welcome to Season 4 of Think Like a Vegan, a companion podcast to my book entitled Think Like a Vegan, which is also available in paperback and audiobook. Let's talk about the origins of veganism. How far back does this movement really go? It's easy to assume veganism is a modern phenomenon, but the truth is much more interesting. A few years ago, I had a fascinating conversation with historian Vance Lehmkhul at the American Vegan Center in Philadelphia. He shared incredible stories about 19th century Americans, abolitionists, feminists, socialist reformers, all people who saw deep connections between diet, ethics, and justice long before the word vegan even existed. These weren't fringe figures. They were serious thinkers who recognized how food choices reflected broader values about compassion, nonviolence, and our relationship with the natural world. Now, Vance has brought these overlooked stories together in his new book, Revolutionary Peace, which shows how Philadelphia became an unexpected hub for these early vegetarian and vegan ideas. What's remarkable is how contemporary many of these early debates feel. The questions they wrestled with about ethics, sustainability, and living according to one's values are the same ones we're grappling with today. It makes you wonder, how much have we really progressed, and what can we learn from these early visionaries? Before we hear from Vance, here's a bit of background about him. Vance is director and tour operator at the American Vegan Center in Philadelphia. He developed a unique walking tour of vegan and vegetarian history in Philly, and I highly recommend it. It's super fun. All the stories blew me away. He leads these tours from the American Vegan Center, which is the first national vegan center in the U.S., and if you want to organize a private history tour, including some of the delicious vegan food in Philly, that's possible also. And by the way, Philly is a terrific vegan food destination city. But back to Vance. He's also the marketing and communications director of the American Vegan Society. Vance has 30 years of experience in journalism in Philadelphia, and he's an illustrator too, contributing to best-selling books like Dr. Greger's How Not to Die and many magazines. His book, Revolutionary Peace, How Philadelphia Launched the U.S. Vegetarian and Vegan Movement, combines all his skills in research, writing, and illustrating. With that, Vance, the floor is yours.
All right, great. So I guess I should start by saying my book is called Revolutionary Peace, How Philadelphia Launched the U.S. Vegetarian and Vegan Movement. And this book grew out of my veg history tours that I give at the American Vegan Center. And it is a spot right in the middle of the tourist district of Philadelphia, the old city where all of the important stuff happened and where most of the history that people want to hear about took place. The book goes through, I think it's 12 different key figures, starting in the early 18th century and coming up really intensively through the end of the 19th, and then flashing ahead to a few figures in the 20th who really did outstanding work. And the book grew out of the fact that I would do these tours, but there is just an amazing amount of history there. And the book, other than having something for tourists and Philadelphians who come and take the tour, there are, I would say, two main points to it. One is just to get across to people something that goes against the mainstream idea of vegetarianism and veganism, which is that it's something recent and marginal that kind of emerged maybe in the mid-20th century, whereas, in fact, what I call the striving for the vegan ideal has been a fundamental part of human civilization, at least since it has been recorded in history. And probably longer than that, there have always been a segment of the human population who dissented from the mainstream view that it was absolutely necessary to cage and raise animals and kill them, which is a separate issue from whether humans should eat animals at all. This is a fundamental argument to human civilization, and we should treat it as such. And the other thing is specific to Philadelphia. It's the birthplace of the country, of democracy, blah, blah, blah. But it also has this particular history that I feel is more suited to the 21st century than some of the history that we're used to, where we're trying to put these men on a pillar because they were involved in establishing the American experiment, so to speak. But a lot of those men are very problematic, to use a loaded term, whereas we have several in this that do not have. For one thing, I'm going to mention that Washington and Jefferson, two of the key founding fathers, probably the two most key founding fathers that history tours talk about. They were absolute bastards when it came to enslaving people, and what they did once, even within that basic normative paradigm, they really went above and beyond to be what we might call problematic as slave owners. I want Philadelphia as a whole, I want the Philadelphia tourist industry to integrate some of these heroes, not just because I want to see more people talking about vegetarianism and veganism, but I really do think it would be better for Philadelphia as we go forward. I really think that there should be a move to integrate a lot of these, so I'm putting them out there. And this book, A Revolutionary Peace, again, I should specify that I call it veg history because I'm obviously being ambiguous between vegetarian and vegan, which some people object to. But really, when you're talking about history, the further back in history you go, the harder it is to necessarily nail down whether somebody was what we would today call a vegetarian or what we would today call a vegan. So that's why I've specified that it's the striving for the vegan ideal that really pervades all of history, and it has been manifest by different people in different ways and at different levels. And there is a huge amount of history that predates the 18th century, obviously, but this book concentrates on this more recent time period and really just people who did significant work in Philadelphia. So the first person that we mentioned on the tour, in order to pull people in with a familiar face, but also he's the first chronologically, is Benjamin Franklin, who a lot of people have heard, Ben Franklin was a vegetarian. And it's more complicated than that because being Ben Franklin, he was somebody who was always curious to find out about and even get his hands into the latest cultural trend and keep track. And that's one of the things that made him such an innovator. But he was also somebody who was always ready to play the odds and play the situation to his benefit. So he was somebody, of all the people in the book, he's the least committed vegetarian because he went vegetarian several times and he quit being vegetarian several times. I don't think that he died a vegetarian, and that's kind of the thing about vegetarian. It is something that you can try and then leave and come back, and that's exactly what he did, as opposed to, in my opinion, using the word vegan. If you are legitimately going vegan, you're basically committing to something for the rest of your life, but being vegan means that you are saying, I understand the situation, and now my place in the world is not going to be used to further this terrible situation. So Ben Franklin was not anywhere near that. He did one of the things that earns him a spot in the book is that he is the first person to try to introduce tofu into the American colonies, and as well documented, he didn't just send a description of it to Philadelphia from London, but he actually acquired soybean seeds and sent them over to the premier botanist, John Bartram, the premier botanist in all of North America. But we don't know why Bartram didn't follow up and get a whole tofu industry going in the 1770s, but we know he got the package, but from there the trail ends. We'll leave Benjamin Franklin now. In contrast, Benjamin Franklin's friend and contemporary, Benjamin Lay, was somebody whose vegetarianism was very much about a moral outlook and a really visionary sense of the individual versus the world, or the individual in sync with the world. And Benjamin Lay really strived to put himself in sync with the actual planet rather than being in sync with human society. And he absented himself. He wound up living in a cave for the last 25 years of his life. He was a little person who came to Philadelphia from England, and came to Philadelphia partly because he wanted to get away from all of the hypocrisies that he was seeing, especially in Barbados, where he had lived for a while. Ran a shop there, got to know some enslaved people because they were many of his customers, and formed the opinion that was not common whatsoever at the time, that human slavery had to be abolished, not just improved or reformed or regulated or anything. It had to go. So he came to Philadelphia as a Quaker. He joined Philadelphia Meeting, and he was appalled to find that the rich Quakers who ran Philadelphia Meeting were slave keepers. They enslaved people. And so from that point, which was around 1732, he devoted the rest of his life to trying to wake up his fellow Quakers to this fundamental problem, this fundamental contradiction, where you have a religion where you're saying our religion is based in peace and nonviolence, and the people you put in charge of it here are engaging in this fundamentally violent institution. And so he really became the first abolitionist activist and the first guerrilla street theater practitioner that we know of in North America. He would do these little stunts to really get people's attention and just try to shock them into realizing what they were doing. And I'm not going to go into all those now because we're going through this parade, but he had by that point spent much of his life with normal-bodied people looking down on him, literally, and he did develop this kind of ornery streak. And so he wasn't worried about being ostracized because he was already ostracized to start with. And he was a fan of Diogenes, the vegetarian philosopher who founded the philosophy of cynicism. And cynicism was based on the individual stepping aside from society in order to critique the hypocrisies of mainstream society. And Benjamin Lay did a lot of that. Benjamin Lay then inspired a good number of Quakers, younger generation of Quakers, who actually took up the cause, but then moderated the methodology to have a kind of kinder, gentler activism that wasn't so much about getting in people's faces, but more really trying to get institutional change to happen. And they did get the Quakers in 1754 to release this epistle, the Epistle of 1754, the letter where the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting went on record saying no Quakers should own slaves. But it was just basically an opinion piece. 4 years later, they actually got it to the point where they said, all right, any Quaker who is engaged in buying and selling people, that can be an infraction, among others, that will lead to disownment. And then finally, the Philadelphia Quakers did completely outlaw engaging in any form of slavery for its Quakers, and they did that in 1776, which is interesting because you had another group in Philadelphia trying to establish something in 1776 that's the thing that we remember about 1776, the Declaration of Independence and all that. But those people, we have to point out, they had a chance to really do something. They did do something amazing, to create the United States. Great. But they had a chance to do something that was also logically coherent and establish, since their entire premise of founding the United States was that they were being oppressed and they needed to be free from this oppression, they had a chance to establish something that was free from oppression, that did not condone human slavery. But the Northerners felt they couldn't bother trying to wake up the South. They had to have them as partners for this war. So there's this concept, people back then, they just didn't know. And you had people like Benjamin Lay who were crackpots. The general concept of Benjamin Lay was that he was a crazy person, which he may have, as he even said, oppression will drive a man crazy. But they wanted to believe that about him in order to be able to dismiss his ideas. But these younger generation that I mentioned, among them was Anthony Benezet, who is somebody that everybody in America anyway should know his name, because he's really one of the most important Americans who ever lived. He took up Benjamin Lay's cause, and really the Epistle of 1754 that I mentioned, he proposed and wrote the first draft of that. He was also instrumental in getting the 1758 and 1776 changes made, and he wrote books about Africa, about what Africa was really like, rather than the white people's fantasy version of Africa, which was just this continent full of savages who were uneducated and uncivilized and blah, blah, blah. They could excuse themselves for going over and destroying their civilization and kidnapping people and forcing them into slavery. So Benezet is just an amazing person. Benezet, like Benjamin Lay, was vegetarian, and both of them really, they took it further than just saying, I'm not eating meat. There is some question now as to whether Benjamin Lay drank milk, but he did, when he was living in the cave, he had a garden to grow food, but he also kept bees and ate their honey. So he does not qualify by our modern definition of vegan, but he was really the veganist guy around. Benezet followed him in a lot of ways, and also, like Benjamin Lay, he would not wear wool, he would not wear leather. And I believe that he also picked up Benjamin Lay's practice of walking rather than ever taking a horse and carriage, because as Benjamin Lay said, I can walk, why should the horses work for me? Now, Benezet, my transition into Benezet was that he's an example not just of somebody who got it, but who was right there personally lobbying the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, personally lobbying these people that he lived among and knew, to say, look, if you're starting a country because you're being oppressed, it doesn't make sense then to have oppression built into what you're starting. And there are a lot of people that said, yeah, I get it, but we got to set that aside right now because this is a necessary thing. Just, again, a lot of people said, yeah, I get it that animals don't want to die, but it's necessary to kill them. And sometimes people like to say things are necessary because they've looked into the thing a little bit, a situation a little bit, and not looked further to see that it would be possible otherwise. So I would go on all day about Benezet, but suffice to say, he not only got the Philadelphia Quakers to move in this direction, which affected the London Quakers, but he also then sent his books over to England to members of Parliament and to people who became the first British abolitionist activists. Granville Sharp was radicalized into abolitionism by reading Anthony Benezet's Short History of Africa. So was John Wesley, who founded Methodism and who was also a vegetarian. So was Thomas Clarkson. And when I say so was, they were radicalized by this same book. Thomas Clarkson, who then, after Benezet had died, worked with William Wilberforce to try to get Britain to divest itself from the slave trade, which was what Benezet had been saying to them since the 1760s when he was trying to do that because the slave trade that was in Philadelphia was being run out of Great Britain. They finally did achieve that in 1808, but when they would propose this bill year after year and Wilberforce or somebody else would stand up arguing for it, they were reading things usually either that they had originally gotten from Benezet or sometimes reading and quoting Benezet himself. So you have that whole aspect, and that did the whole tie-in between vegetarianism and ethics that was established in that community, especially among Quakers, among Philadelphia Quakers. And that's kind of one channel that continues, which we can pick up on. But there was another channel of just people picking up on the health effects of vegetarianism and looking at, we don't need to kill animals. Why do that when we can get adequate nutrition this other way? And frankly, nutrition science obviously advanced a great deal in the 20th century. These were people like groping around in the dark about what nutrition really was in the 18th century and really working against this concept, this mainstream concept that you got to eat meat, you got to eat animal products. The Bible Christians in the early 19th century really pushed back against that and said, no, there's no need to eat animals. And in fact, God does not want us to eat animals. It's right there in Genesis 1:29 when he prescribes the ideal diet for humans back when in paradise is paradise before humans have wrecked everything. And it's a vegan diet. And so they were very influential within Philadelphia. They worked for a while, struggled for a while, but eventually started getting some traction. And just at the point that they started getting big, a fellow named Sylvester Graham came to Philadelphia to preach about temperance. And when I say preach, to lecture about temperance. He had been a Presbyterian minister. He left the Presbyterian religion, but continued lecturing with that same kind of fiery, charismatic style, and he was very popular as a lecturer. And he and the Bible Christians both shared this commitment to temperance. And there is no smoking gun that proves this, but historians agree, and the Bible Christians actually say in their own history that Sylvester Graham met the Bible Christians, and because of that, became what we would now call a vegetarian, and started incorporating that, and in fact founding his entire lectures on this concept of how people should eat. And so that became a big thing, especially when he collected his lectures into a book called The Science of Human Life. He published a book after leaving Philadelphia. Oh, I should mention the key thing historically that is the closest to a smoking gun is that he was brought to Philadelphia by an organization specifically about temperance. And he did his 6 months of lectures around town on that, and then resigned his commission at the end of 6 months, but kept on lecturing. And it was at that point that his lectures now he did retain the concept that you shouldn't be drinking booze, but he focused much more on this overall regimen of eating that actually became pretty popular, became called Grahamism in the mid-19th century, and it affected a lot of people then.
We'll pause here for a musical break, after which we'll return with more from Vance Lehmkhul. This is Dappling by Matthew Gerstenberger, who's been contributing his musical soundscapes to my podcast for the last few years. I'm absolutely grateful, and I enjoy them very much. I hope you do too. We're back for the second part of Vance Lehmkhul's discussion about the long and entangled history of veganism and vegetarianism in the U.S.
To carry the Bible Christians, the Sylvester Graham story, in 1850, William Metcalf of the Bible Christians conceived that there should be an American Vegetarian Society and got Sylvester Graham on board, got a few other vegetarians. They established that AVS, American Vegetarian Society, was really the thing putting the concept of vegetarianism forth into the culture through the entire 1850s. Then the Civil War torpedoed that. But we're talking about vegetarian now, and that arose over in England, where you are, at a place called Alcott House that was named after Bronson Alcott, father of Louisa May Alcott, who came to Philadelphia and, I assert, was radicalized by his immersion in the Loganian Library, which was the biggest repository of books in North America. And Bronson Alcott was a teacher who had never finished high school and never gone to college, but he was constantly reading books to educate himself, and he got a hold of all these books with these Greek philosophers. This is right at the point. It's easy to forget that prior to this point, if you wanted to read Greek philosophers or Roman philosophers from antiquity, you had to be able to speak Greek or Latin. But finally, in the beginning of the 18th century, Thomas Taylor and a couple of others really made an effort to translate all these things into English, and so they became much more accessible to English speakers, and Bronson Alcott was one of them. So he after leaving Philadelphia, started a school in Boston, which this guy Greaves over there just outside of London found out about, and he was inspired to start this entire community that he named after Bronson Alcott. And it was in the April 1842 edition of their newsletter that we find the first use of the word vegetarian. And so he invited Bronson to come and see this place, which essentially was vegan. They didn't obviously have the word vegan. Enough to put on their shoulders that they had introduced the word vegetarian into the language, but it really was a vegan community. That was the philosophy we can now identify, and Bronson Alcott was just so inspired by that he decided to start a vegan commune back in the States, which he did, and which there's a lot of great stories around that, but long story short, the commune didn't even last a full year. Bronson was not a very good organizer. He was not a very good large-scale farmer, which they wanted to basically live off the grid like Benjamin Lay and be apart from society and create their own society and be completely self-sufficient. They just didn't have the chops to do it, and they also found as they were going forward, living out this philosophy day to day, that the two key people running it, Bronson Alcott and Charles Lane, who had come from Alcott House, found that they did not completely agree on what the idea of this commune was. So they started fighting, everybody started fighting, and the whole thing fell apart, especially because winter came on and their food harvest was not what they had hoped for. They were wearing layers and layers of linen rather than wearing any wool. They wouldn't wear cotton either because, like most 19th century vegetarians, they were abolitionists. So they split up. But that commune had different repercussions, which I'm just going to mention. Henry David Thoreau, who is one of the visitors to this experiment in trying to live off the grid and being self-sufficient, where you had these three people at the core, Bronson and Charles Lane and Bronson's wife, Abigail, who were constantly fighting with each other. And he may have said something like, what if you tried the same thing, but with just one person? And so 2 years later, Henry David Thoreau built a shed next to Walden Pond and did the whole experiment that he wrote up as the book Walden, which kind of what became his calling card to literary society. Just marching forward through time, we have Carolyn Earl White really dominating the second half of the 19th century, or really the late 19th century. She gets started after the Civil War with the founding of the ASPCA in New York, and the guy who founded that, Henry Bergh, helped her and a Philadelphia businessman to co-found the Pennsylvania SPCA. Right after the ASPCA was founded, different states started founding their own SPCAs, and Pennsylvania's was the first. But when it was time to organize the board for this organization, Carolyn Earl White was not eligible to be on the board because she was a woman. And it's one thing to be the founder of something, but to be involved in day-to-day decision-making, what if her uterus was acting up that day? The men would have all these great excuses for keeping women out of power. And so you have to imagine this little conversation where the guys were saying, Carolyn, nothing personal, it's strictly business. And her saying, don't mind me, I'm just going to go over here and start another organization called the Women's Branch of the PASPCA. And so she did. She created this whole all-woman organization to get things done. And that may sound like a vanity move or screw you to the guys, but that organization is still around today doing good work up in Bensalem, PA. It's now called the Women's Animal Center, and it was that organization that started the first animal shelters, and it was a result of having animal shelters and being faced with this problem that sometimes you may have more animals than you can find homes for, and what then to do, and having to, quote-unquote, euthanize an animal that is not terminally ill or anything, that Carolyn Earl White wound up, after bringing this up to a friend who was a doctor at Penn, she wound up in this court battle where the doctors at Penn wanted to force the shelter to hand over any excess animals so they could be used in medical experiments. And so Carolyn Earl White then founded the American Anti-Vivisection Society after winning that court battle. And there's plenty more about her, but we're moving on to Henry Clubb, another titan of vegetarianism in the second half of the late 19th century. Clubb had been at Alcott House when Charles Lane came to America and left his position at Alcott House to be part of Bronson Alcott's vegan commune. There was a vacancy, and Henry Clubb was the person who stepped into it as a teenager. And so from a young age, he was immersed in this kind of vegan the community, and he called himself a vegetarian. I think he was pretty close to what we would call vegan now. He wound up founding the VSA, the Vegetarian Society of America. As I said, the American Vegetarian Society got torpedoed by the Civil War. Clubb came back and in 1888 started the Vegetarian Society of America, which was a little more pro-vegan. We would now call it pro-vegan than the old American Vegetarian Society. And one of the interesting items, they had their own magazine, and there's an item in the magazine talking about how peanut butter was now available, which John Harvey Kellogg, some people say, oh, he invented peanut butter. Obviously, he did not invent the concept of crushing up peanuts and making them into a spread. We know that Native Americans, for example, were making nut butters and nut milks before Europeans even arrived. But John Harvey Kellogg was responsible for putting this in a jar and calling it peanut butter and putting it on grocers' shelves. And he called it peanut butter because his concept was this would replace cow's milk butter. He thought people would just swap one for one and not notice or care that everything they ate tasted like peanuts. But this item says there's this new thing that you can now use in place of butter. This should go a long way to satisfy those vegetarians who strenuously object to anything animal. So this is in 1897. They're just casually mentioning, if you're a vegetarian, you must know some who really take it all the way. They didn't have the word vegan then. It would be another almost 50 years before that was coined. But it does show us, and there are plenty of other examples that I could talk about from history, that people have gone all the way to what we would now call veganism, but they didn't have that word. They couldn't rally around a common concept like they can now. Other great vegetarians in the book, Peace Pilgrim, who got her start in the mid-20th century, and she walked across the country for peace. She did a kind of this big stunt walking from Pasadena to New York in 1953, and then she was doing this in order to get press attention so that she could talk about the need to take peace seriously as a social priority. And she got to New York and had a press conference where she talked about that, and then started walking back across the country, and for the rest of her life just kept walking across the country. And really, there is some discussion that does seem to be the inspiration for the Forrest Gump thing of running across the country when that was written up. But either way, Peace Program, great vegetarian who was based in Philadelphia but didn't spend a lot of time in Philadelphia because she was constantly walking. But also, I've got to give a shout out to Jay Dinshaw, who was raised vegetarian. He and his brother in the mid-50s were hearing this new word vegan coming from across the pond and saying, oh, should we go that direction, or is it enough just to be vegetarian? They decided that they should answer that question by coming to Philadelphia and touring a slaughterhouse. And they came and saw dairy cows being killed, walked right through the killing floor, getting their shoes all bloody. And when they got out of the tour, walked out onto the sidewalk, Jay stepped out of his bloody shoes. And I had a discussion with Freya Dinshaw, the current president of AVS, who was Jay Dinshaw's wife, about whether we should include this detail, because it does make Jay a little problematic in that he left the shoes there, these bloody shoes on the sidewalk, supposedly. That's littering. So how can he be a great hero if he's littering the streets of Philadelphia? But he did step out of his bloody shoes and say, I'm going to go vegan, and I'm going to work until all the slaughterhouses are closed. So he then founded the American Vegan Society, which is responsible for all kinds of stuff that I can't go into. But I will mention that Freya, in 1965, published the first book in the United States with vegan in the title, which I simply say the first vegan cookbook in the U.S., but Freya's not, oh, no, there were some other books that had plant-based. They were all plant-based recipes, but if you don't say vegan, it's not vegan. So that was just one of the many things that they did. Obviously, they also are the force behind the American Vegan Center, where I work. They are the publisher of this book, Revolutionary Peace, and they've just done an amazing amount of stuff. And then I also talk in the book about, just as kind of one key pioneer to stand in for the entire burgeoning of Philadelphia's vegan food scene, somebody who was really at the outset of the current wave, was Alphonse Austin, who ran Basic for Vegetarian snack bar in the Reading Terminal Market for 30 years, starting in 1981, shortly after the market opened. And this was the first Black-owned business in the Reading Terminal Market. It was Alphonse's vision. She called it Basic for because she had been a nutritionist at Hahnemann Hospital, and it's easy to forget that back when I was coming up, and probably, I don't know, you did grow up in the U.S., right? Or did you not? Oh,
I did. I did,
right.
Partly.
Right.
Partly.
So you remember that we had the supposed 4 food groups that were supposed to guide your decision-making, that you had to be sure to have some representative of each group in every meal, and 2 of the groups were meat and dairy. And that was how the USDA, our government, was telling us we had to eat. It was necessary to eat animals. Finally, they changed that to the food pyramid, which still included animal products as something you needed to have, but not as much. Now we're really at this kind of ambiguous place where the USDA is trying to move to more reality-based nutrition advice, which it's not that able to do because of all of the strings that are attached to it by corporate interests who have been running this kind of nutritional governmental nexus from the get-go. But either way, she called it Basic for, meaning that she had a new 4 food groups that were all vegetarian, and it started as a vegetarian stand, and then in the late 90s evolved into a vegan stand when she decided to veganize. The key step, I think, in that is when she had a sandwich called a Philly steak, which was a vegetarian cheesesteak. And when I was going vegan, but I wasn't vegan yet, but I was going vegan, and I asked her, why don't you just change to a vegan cheese for this, and you'll have a vegan cheesesteak, and that would be really wild. And she said, I haven't found a vegan cheese that I like, which, fair enough, this was the 90s. But in 1999, she did find a cheese that she liked and veganized the Philly steak, and that is the first that I have been able to find in my research, the first vegan cheesesteak as a regular menu item at any Philadelphia venue. And now we have dozens of vegan cheesesteaks in Philadelphia, and Alphonse really laid the groundwork for a lot of that and other things. Right now we have a deli, Love Vegan Deli in Reading Terminal Market, which is great. It's great food, great people. But that's an overview of the book. And the main point, again, is that there have always been these kind of 2 strands represented in Philadelphia of people trying to eat healthier and help other people to eat healthier and not destroy their bodies with animal protein, and people who simply said, I don't care that much about health. I just can't be part of this violence that is normative. Even though it's normative, I'm going to just completely step away from it. And there have been people that straddled both and people that went entirely one way or the other. But it's really just a fascinating history to me. And I hope fascinating to all of our listeners who have had to listen to me bloviate about it for these many minutes. All right, thank you. Emmy, back to you.
I think this is great. Thank you so much, Vance. I find this a really interesting topic. The book is really interesting. Each of the historical figures, characters, I don't know how you want to say, each of them has such interesting connections with the other and even things that continue into the present. So I really highly recommend people read this book. And I want to ask you, so where can people get this book?
Yeah, the easiest thing for your listeners is to go to AmericanVegan.org, or if they happen to be anywhere near Philadelphia, they can just come on into the American Vegan Center, where we have a few copies right there, and they can pick one up and take it home.
Well, which is the American Vegan Center is a really cute
American
space.
Vegan Center.
So tell a little bit about that.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we started there in 2021, at the end of 2021, the concept being basically that the American Vegan Society has done all this amazing work for, at that point, 61 years, at this point, 65 years. But I would say that it's a little bit like Anthony Benezet. Anthony Benezet did all of this very foundational primary work to create the entire transatlantic abolitionist movement, but he was someone who was very humble and liked to keep his name off of things. So as a result, a lot of this has come down through history. And of course, you combine that with the fact that white male historians like to glorify the actions of guys getting into fights with each other, or guys being elected to this office or another, or whatever, things that you can very easily quantify and say they did this number of people died, or they were in this office for this number of years. Whereas people like Anthony Benezet, you have to really get into what they did to understand it. And it was something that, like vegetarianism and veganism, it was set completely against the prevailing cultural norm at the time. And so people at the time dismissed it because they didn't see what was going on in terms of the groundwork that Benezet was laying, building on the groundwork laid by Benjamin Lay. Yeah, so the American Vegan Society, similarly, Jay Dinshaw was constantly focused on just getting things done rather than making people aware that he was doing this or that they should know the brand AVS. Later, we had an organization that actually, let's just say they didn't do as good a job as some other organizations of focusing on making people say their name whenever they thought of animal activism. So the concept was to put ourselves right in a high foot traffic area where people would happen across us. We have a sign out. There's a huge window sign. This is American Vegan Center. And then we have a hanging sign like you would find in hanging outside an 18th century tavern that has our bell logo and just says vegan, so that people can see that from a block away. So we really want to just be there for anybody who happens across, and the concept is to, if someone is ready to take any step in a vegan direction, to help connect them with whatever tools or resources are going to make that more doable, or if people are already vegan, to connect them with vegan food info about Philadelphia or with actual vegan food. We do sell some kind of lunch style or snack-style vegan foods. We also do vegan events, cooking classes, trivia nights, lectures by famous book authors such as Amelia Lease.
It was a really fun event. I enjoyed that.
Yeah. And different kinds of things. We'd have open mic night that people have really found to be just a good excuse to come and hang out with other vegans. So it is really helping to, I think, to challenge the cultural norm and chip away at the notion of necessity and moral excusability of eating animals by showing there are these people who not only are doing this right now, but there have always been people doing this. So it's not like it's this crazy thing that you have to be the first person on the moon to do. And I like to say that I'm there most days standing behind the counter looking out at the sidewalk, and we have usually probably several hundred people walk by out front, and of those, maybe a dozen or so will actually come in the course of the day. Maybe on Saturdays and Sundays, we routinely get closer to 30 or 40 people, sometimes 50, sometimes 60. Main thing being, we don't get all of them to get curious enough to walk in, but I do watch people's expressions and see over and over this expression of somebody looking at our sign in our window. And we also have another sign over the window that says American Vegan Center, and just saying to them, so what? So there's now, vegan has gotten so big that there's an American Vegan Center? And yeah, it has. So their worldview just 10 seconds before has to be updated to expand, to include this fact that we're there, and some of them will be intrigued enough to come in. But even those who aren't have to start thinking about the concept of vegan in a way that they weren't going to before. So I think it's doing a certain amount of low-key activism, even absent people coming in and engaging and being subjected to listening to me do a veg history tour, which I guess is the more high-key.
Obviously.
I consider it a form of activism to educate people, and not everybody would
I agree with that,
but I really do.
I completely agree with that. And I also very much believe that even existing as a vegan is a form of activism. So the fact that that the American Vegan Center exists and has big signs, which are great, by the way, and I love the logo. I really loved my visit there, and I tell everybody to put it on their itinerary when they go to the U.S. And yeah, it's a great space. It's a great place, and it's fantastic to have something like that. I'm thrilled. Then before we go, is there anything that you want to promote? Where can people follow your work, if that's a thing?
Yeah, they can find American Vegan Center on Facebook, Am Vegan Center on Twitter, American Vegan Center, all one word, on Instagram. But also, we have an email newsletter that's the link is on the homepage of AmericanVegan.org, so you can keep track of what's happening there. I would also just like to give a shout out to the play, The Return of Benjamin Lay, which Marcus Rediker, who is the author of The Fearless Benjamin Lay, which came out in 2017, and really is responsible for me and just about anybody else today talking about Benjamin Lay, because he was largely, as I said, people at the time liked to dismiss and ignore him and pretend that he didn't exist. And really the history of what happened with him was something that for a long time only other Quakers knew about. Quaker historians would keep track of him just as this interesting, colorful Quaker. So Marcus Rediker, who wrote that book, then co-wrote a play, a one-man play, which Mark Pavanelli, a little person, embodies Benjamin Lay and tells his story. Some of it is bound up with his influence on the abolition movement. And again, I have to stress that for Benjamin Lay, he didn't see a lot of daylight between the humans' oppression of humans and humans' oppression of animals. He saw it as part of one big problem. And in fact, when Marcus Rediker, after writing The Fearless Benjamin Lay, he did a graphic novel collaborating with this artist to create a graphic novel version of this, which has a page of Benjamin Lay telling his story about how he became vegetarian after starting this garden and having this groundhog that was constantly eating part of his garden. And he eventually found and killed the groundhog and then dismembered the groundhog and put his body parts up at the corners of the garden to scare away other animals, like, you come here, this is going to happen to you. And right after doing that, he recognized that he was aping, we call it aping, he was echoing the actions of the British monarchy back during the English Revolution, which had done that with human beings. And so he again saw this correspondence between human suppression of humans and human suppression of animals. And it was at exactly that point that he said, all right, that's it. I'm going to not have anything to do with violence toward animals from here on. And he kept to it to the best that we can tell.
Fantastic. Thank you again. Really appreciate you coming to talk with me today. And I hope to see you in Philly soon. And I hope lots of people go.
I hope to see you. All right. Thank you for having me on, and appreciate the opportunity to share some of this knowledge, which, again, I wish I could take credit for these fantastical stories, but they're all straight out of history. I really hope, whether it's through this book or in other ways, people will educate themselves about some of these threads of the striving for the vegan ideal that have gone throughout human history and are still affecting a lot of things today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Emmy.
When we go round, we burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round.
That's it from me, Emmy Leese. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com if you have questions, comments, or want to suggest a guest or a topic for discussion. I'd be happy to hear from you. And you can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialeese.com, and on Substack and on social media. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.